Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. You already know Aakar Patel as a perceptive columnist, as the author of stinging critiques on the Modi government, and of course as the brave chairman of Amnesty International. Today I'm going to introduce a fourth Aakar Patel to you, the novelist. His first novel was recently published, and here it is. It's called After Messiah. It's a riveting political thriller, but it also contains a classic moral struggle that is typical of Indian politics. The struggle between tactics and strategy on the one hand, and principle and morality on the other. And that is what makes this book not just special, but fascinating. Joining me now to talk about his book is the author, Aakar Patel. Aakar Patel, I'm going to begin a little differently to the introduction. Your book starts as a roman à clef before it develops into a powerful story about the character of Indian politics and the struggle between strategy and tactics on the one hand and principle and morality on the other. Let's start with the roman à clef before we come to the political conflict. In the first chapter, the Prime Minister is someone called the Big Man, but you deliberately don't give him a name. Although he dies by page 3, his personality, his political strategies, the legacy he leaves behind, and attempts to reverse that legacy are a strong leitmotif that runs right through the book. So let me start by asking, is the big man Narendra Modi?
There are certainly elements to Mr. Modi that I have looked at, but the novel began in theory as a history of our times told through the absurdity of what was going on. Somebody was talking about the fact that a missile had taken off accidentally from India and landed in Pakistan, which we did not acknowledge for a day and a half. We have a leader who abolished a currency overnight and it was acceptable to the audience. I felt that I ought to write about that. Unfortunately, I didn't know what writing a novel meant, and it required character transition, that the person you began with should be different at the end of the book. That's what makes novels different. Having tried and failed to do that, what I did instead was to try and finish off the person who was influencing the polity on the first couple of pages and move the novel forward from there.
But let me tell you why this big man, as you call him, is so strikingly similar to Narendra Modi. Of the big man's speeches delivered from the Red Fort, you write, the language and symbols of democracy were subsumed by references made by the ruler to the ruler, speaking of himself in the third person. That's typically Narendra Modi, isn't it?
It is. I think that he, more than anybody else, signifies that sort of style. And I was very fortunate as a first time novelist to have such a person to be a model on how a character should be framed and how he ought to be written about.
In fact, there are many other obvious hints which make you certain as you read the book that the big man is none other than Narendra Modi. And here's another one. After writing that inaugurations were particularly important, you say ministries focused on delivering the finest possible event or ceremony the big man could preside over. Actually, delivery of governance, you say, was less important. Again, that is so true of the way Mr. Modi enjoys inaugurating things. He thrives on it.
No, certainly that would be the way that I would see it. I'm sure that his fans, his supporters, his voters might see it differently. But the idea of spectacle taking a precedence over governance has been quite firmly established. And once again, it gives you material as a novelist which you might not find in most parts of the democratic world. Such,
Sorry, carry on.
no, such flamboyance, such color, such self-referential material is extremely rare, and for a novelist, great fun to work with.
Now, here's a third hint that convinced me the big man is Narendra Modi. It's the way the opposition is treated, and it's so similar to the way the opposition is treated in real life today. You're right. The political opposition was set upon as if it were an internal enemy. The state and its agencies were unleashed on them with such regularity that staying out of jail and surviving through the raids kept them occupied rather than actual politics. And that is completely the situation the opposition believes they face at Narendra Modi's hands today.
Absolutely right. I think that New India, as we call it, has much to offer the democratic world in terms of how a polity ought not to be run. That if there is space that is made available for democracy through a constitutional and through process, that space ought not to be closed off either fully or halfway through measures such as the one we've seen. I think that having the opposition permanently defending itself from central agencies is one of the aspects of New India's democracy that we ought to be alarmed about.
Now, so far, Aakar Patel, we've discussed reflections of Narendra Modi, which are accurate of the way we all see and know him. But your book also has what I would call an imaginary reference. And this time, interestingly, it's to the cupboards in his bedroom. You write that when he died and his successor, Meera, walked into what used to be his bedroom and she opened the cupboards, this is what she found. I'm quoting you. The cupboards she opened were enormous and filled with the big man's clothing, row upon row of costumes arranged by occasion, by color, by season. There were cabinets filled with just accessories, hats, turbans, shawls. And as I read that, I said to myself, this must be what Mr. Modi's cupboards actually look like. And you brought out in that description costumes arranged by occasion, by color, and by season, something that we all have noticed, that he's very meticulously dressed, always to suit the occasion, and he always has accessories to go with his kurta or with his bangala. You picked it up by alluding to his cabinet and his cupboards.
I would love to be a fly on the wall on any morning in that home of his where he plans what it is that he's going to wear, what the thought process is in terms of how to accessorize, which, as you say, and as we all know, he does really well. And the amount of energy and time that goes into this, it would be interesting. He's never going to be properly biographed, of course, because in our part of the world, we don't write about leaders anything other than hagiographies. But should he have been, and if he were to be, it would be fascinating to know how much time is spent, how much effort is spent in what he wears.
Now, in Woodhouse, Jeeves would lay out the clothes that Bertie Wooster wore. Bertie Wooster never chose them himself. Do you imagine that Mr. Modi has a Jeeves who decides what he wears? Or do you think Mr. Modi does this entirely on his own, by his own choice and selection?
I think he does it on his own. There is no question that he would let somebody else pick what it is that he should wear, which is why I think it would be nice to know how much time is spent on it.
Okay, let's now come to the powerful political story that lies at the heart of your book. I deliberately began with the roman clef because I think that was fun, and it verges on what I call a little bit of cheekiness, which I think enhances the book because cheekiness is what authors should be. But the heart of the book is the political story. And I want to be very careful that I don't give anything away. When the big man dies, his immediate successor is a woman called Meera, who works for an NGO lawyers collective. She's a single unwed mother. Her daughter is in jail, and she despises the sort of politics the big man and his party symbolize. Her rivals try to shame her by revealing all of this i.e., her past, and she decides to respond by giving an interview where she readily and fully tells the truth about her life. It's one of the most memorable and one of the most powerful moments in your book. That interview is riveting. How easy was it for you to write?
Relatively easy, because as a journalist, I know how it ought to go, at least. And certainly I know how it has been going in the last 10 years or so. The idea that an interviewer is not an opponent, is not a pugilist, but somebody who is meant to have a conversation, a decent one and a direct one, is, I think, has become almost alien to our shows. There might be a few exceptions, and I know that I'm talking to one of them. But that's what good journalism ought to be, that you speak to somebody, you ask them hard questions, and there's no issue with people being asked direct, hard questions. The question, to my mind, is really what the interviewer ought to be doing after that question is asked. And hectoring, bullying has become the norm here. I thought it would be nice to show the reader what it used to be like 30 years ago and what it is like in many parts of the world.
But the important thing that emerges from your interview is not the handling of it by the anchor, but the manner in which the Prime Minister responds to questions that were perhaps intended to embarrass her. Certainly, her opponents would have thought they would floor her, and she handles them with a deftness that is truly so unusual of an Indian politician. I'm going to quote from that interview. She's first asked, "May I ask you if you have a comment about the charges your daughter faces?" And remember, her daughter is in jail at the moment. And she replies nonchalantly, "No, not really. I'm confident that she has done nothing wrong and will be soon out." And then the anchor persists. "Have you instructed the police to let her out?" And again, very calmly, she says, "No, I haven't spoken to anyone about the particulars of the case." And the skeptical anchor says, "Nobody?" And she says, "No, it would not be proper and it would not be legal. Also, if someone in my position would not have faith in the law and the justice system, it would be a terrible sign. My daughter has to face the process in the way any other person would, and she will." And one more time, the anchor comes back and says, "That might mean your daughter will be out for some time." And very calmly and coolly, the Prime Minister says, "If that is how it is for others, then that is how it will be for my daughter." That is not an answer that you expect of Indian politicians, many of whose children face charges. But surely you're sending a message to them that when your kids do something wrong and they're hauled up by the law, this is how you must respond.
You read so well, you make my book sound much better than it is. We ought to have you doing audiobooks. I was watching a few interviews with Thatcher and with Indira Gandhi, one of which was in French, which you knew quite well. And I was struck by how much repose there was in their body language, in their words. And I tried to imagine how, if one of them were to be faced with this, the calmness which they normally brought to events of great magnitude. I think the Indira Gandhi one was during the Bangladesh War, and I think the Thatcher one was during the Pound crisis. But they didn't seem to give away any strength of emotion at that point in time, if they were feeling it or they had it, and I'm sure they did. And I tried to imagine how a strong woman might respond, a strong moral woman might respond to questions of that sort, and this is what I came up with.
So, in a sense, Indira Gandhi and Margaret Thatcher were at the back of your mind when you were devising Mira's answers as Prime Minister.
Yes, I think that the conversation is often at the heart of the novel, that you have interaction between people and dialogue that ought to be interesting, that makes the reader move on, that carries the story forward. And I thought that the setting that I looked at fitted quite well what it is that I had seen on video in Thatcher and Gandhi's time.
Now, I'm going to sidestep the details of the story because I said earlier, I definitely don't want to give anything away. This is a thriller, and I have to be careful how much I talk about. What I will do instead is now I'm going to touch upon three powerful debates that emerge from the story. The first is to do with the nature of the Indian state. Speaking through the Prime Minister's house manager. That's another character in your book who hasn't got a name. He's only called the house manager. You write, the state is a violent project, not an altruistic project. It is not an NGO or community organization. It is coercive and violent. The heart and soul of the government is violence. Is that your personal belief as well?
It is. I heard these words spoken by the Business Standard columnist Ajay Shah while he was delivering a lecture in Hyderabad, and I was struck by how accurate this the phrasing was. And these might not be his words exactly, but this is what he thought. And I would entirely agree with the sentiment that the government, the state, has been set up in our part of the world, in our country especially, from the point of view of rule and order and revenue collection, and everything else seems to be demoted. If we look at the fundamental rights, it is the rights of the state through reasonable classification that make this that give the state more power than the fundamental right gives the citizen. And I think that the restrictions and the classifications are held higher, and in that sense, the constitution ought to be read in inverted fashion, where the footnotes become more important and slightly and are used by the state.
Have we lost you? Are you there? Okay, we lost the last bit of that answer, but I think the most of it was quite clear for the audience. Now you make two very interesting points in your book, Aakar Patel, about the violent character of the state. First, you say the elite applauded for being this, i.e., for being violent, especially when someone like the big man helms it. Does that explain why the rich in India today are so often so outspoken and so committed in their support of Narendra Modi? Very rarely do you find the rich criticizing him.
I think state violence is always applauded in our part of the world by what we call the middle classes, but which is actually a reference to the elite. And violence, whether it is on what on people they would see as being terrorists, or violence on separatists, violence on civil society, violence on protesters, violence on trade unionists, is seen as valid. It's seen as something good, that the state ought to use force because what is being said is not something that people agree with. And because of this disagreement, it is not only is it valid, I think it is cheered on, and this is normal. Maybe it is the case that it's happening more often in our time, but it's always been the case here. This is part of our culture, and beating up the weak, particularly beating up of the weak by the state, is seen in a large part of society as something good.
In fact, it's a very important point you make, that this is part of our culture, because the second point you make about the violent state actually reflects precisely that. You say the successful use of violence typically engenders enthusiastic praise. And I think what you're saying is that as long as the violence is targeted at someone else, the majority of people not only don't mind the use of violence, they often accept and applaud it.
I think so, absolutely. I think there is zero evidence to show that that is not the case. And every time state violence is used, there is very little opposition to it from the media. And there always has been. I should concede that this is not necessarily a post-2014 phenomenon. And we've seen it before as well, whether in Punjab or in Kashmir, certainly we have. That having a decent, humane conversation is not preferred. And what the state ought to be doing, going by this view, is pull out the baton, pull out the pellet gun, and the word thrash is used quite easily. Have at it with the protesters.
Now, this leads to the second major debate, and it's really connected to the first one about the violent state. It's about strong leadership. Again, you speak, if I've got your book correctly understood, through the house manager. He says, the nation likes a strong leader, But what does that mean? He asked. Strength is the ability to do something that others cannot, and to show it, to demonstrate that strength. Would I be right in saying strength, therefore, is A, the power to defy rules, and B, the power to create rules that apply only to yourself?
I think so, and I this is a dilemma that we all face. That if you want change in a part in a polity that is difficult to change, where a lot of people, a lot of constituents want change and require it, how is it to be achieved? What are the means that are to be used? And the possession of a great deal of power, shouldn't that necessarily mean that that power is residual in order for it to be exercised? I think that this is a question that I asked myself. I did not have an easy answer to it. But if you look around us, there is an easy answer to it in terms of how it is that Indians respond to it. And we seem to think, many of us, that the possession of power is with an end in mind. It ought to be used. And it ought to be used to be able to affect change, even if that change is something that many people might find problematic, even if that change might be something that might physically, mentally, emotionally affect other people, it ought to be used. To give you one example, I think the abolition of a currency, this is not part of my book, I'm just giving a real life example. How many women were exploited in the days that came after that because they didn't fully understand the rules and only had notes that were now no longer valid or they thought were not valid? How many laborers were exploited? How many people slept hungry and missed how many meals? I don't know. But if you look at the action taken on that day from the point of view of strong leadership, you would find many people who would applaud what was done that night, and very few who would think about what befell those who were made its victim.
You make a very interesting point about this connection between people and strong leaders and how the people applaud strong leaders, particularly when strong leaders do dramatic things. But it's a very interesting point you make. You say, and I'm quoting, the big man did many things people would have recoiled from doing. But the population admired him for this, adored him for this. And to my mind, when I read that, isn't there a problem in this admiration? If people love you when you do the wrong things, and therefore you continue to do them, doesn't the public share some of the responsibility for your wrongdoing? Their encouragement, their applause is making you do more and more of the wrong things. Were they to react differently, it might restrain you.
I would say yes, that ultimately in a democratic society, how much responsibility ought to devolve on the population and the voter is something we ought to think about. And what it is that is wreaked on large parts of the population because of messianism, because of what is called strong leadership, ought also to be considered. And I think that responsibility in democratic societies must not end at the ballot box. I think that for many of us, democracy begins and ends with the vote that you cast once in 5 years. But if you look at, let's say, a think tank like Freedom House, it attributes only 40% of its weightage in measuring democratic societies to voting and voting rights. 60% is about individual rights, the right to freedom of assembly, the right to free expression, the right to freedom of association. And I think these have suffered in our time. And I think they ought to be written about more, they ought to be talked about more. And they necessarily require the participation of the population and not leave everything in the country to parties and to the government.
Let's now come to the third debate. And I think in some ways it's by far the most important in your book. And it's a debate that really concerns politicians. It's the clash and struggle between politics and strategy on the one hand and principles and morality on the other. And to my mind, it raises the question, to achieve the right results, is it acceptable to use the wrong means? The house manager clearly believes it is. He says, and I'm quoting him, sacrificing some of your principles and values and standards for the sake of achieving something meaningful, this is something that should be admired and respected. And that is the complete opposite of Mahatma Gandhi's view. But do you believe that this view, this acceptance that you can sacrifice your principles to achieve something meaningful, is typical not just of the big man, but of most Indian politicians?
Yes, to be fair to them, they find themselves as part of a democratic society where the problems are very big, where the solutions are difficult, where the instruments that are uh, available to the state and to them as ministers, as chief ministers, as the prime minister are limited, that you don't have the resources that a wealthier democracy might have. But you come into politics to be able to affect change. So you've got this problem, you've got this paradox of having power, having the authority, but not having the resources. How do you resolve this? And I think one way of thinking about it is to use your power to bend the rules, to break the rules, to be able to do things that others might not be willing to or don't have the power to because you think you're doing it for the right reasons. I don't question the fact that most politicians in the country aim to do well. I think the idea that they're all bad and they're all corrupt, I don't buy. But what do you do with the difficult problem when you have limited resource? I think you try to make use of the resource that you do have to the full extent possible. And if that requires bending and breaking, so be it.
This, in fact, is the heart of the dilemma Meera faces as caretaker prime minister. It's a sort of ends versus means debate that she's struggling with. But in fact, what it's about is power versus principle. And this is what you write, because you present both sides very forcefully. You say, if there was any framework to understand the world, it was that of power and the ability to enforce change. And then you add the other side was morality, but that was an abstract thing that might be able to keep one warm and content about one's thoughts and conduct, but was otherwise not an effective tool in the real world. And to put it colloquially, I think I understood you to be saying that you can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs.
They used to say of Larry Summers, who had a job in the Clinton presidency, that he could present this forceful argument that would convince everybody, and having made it, he would present the opposite side equally convincingly, ferociously, and then leave people confused about what it is that you're actually saying. Some things are not resolvable, but some things are also not negotiable. And I think that the idea that in a constitutional democracy, even for the right reasons, wrong things are done, and they for the for the reason that they might be seen as right, they become valid. I don't buy. And I think that however strong the argument is on the other side, and it is a strong argument, which I must concede, and I've tried to present it as openly as possible, looking at it from the point of view of somebody who doesn't like it, but wants to see it from the eyes of those who do want to see that sort of thing. And then looking at the other side. And I think that I hope that the reader comes out of it, knowing what it is that at least I feel, if not knowing what it is that they ought to feel.
I think your own voice emerges right at the end of the book, oddly enough, through the voice of an unnamed old woman. That's the moment at which Meera, if I can use that phrase, salvages herself. And an old woman then gives her advice that perhaps should be framed in every prime minister's office in India. The old woman says to Meera, because Meera's asked the old woman, can I achieve the right result by the wrong means? And her answer is this: there is only one right thing to do, and that is the right thing. It's a very powerful message in a very simple sentence. But would I be right in saying that is the final message of your book?
It is, and I think that we ought to give change time, that things are always better in the long run. And if we look back on our own history, a century ago, we were colonized, we didn't have the vote, poverty levels were higher than they are now, literacy levels were very low. We have become a better nation, a better people over time, though it's taken a very long time, decadal almost. But there's this lovely place that most Indians ought to go to or be taken to when in school, Ajanta Ellora, where you had Buddhist monks work on caves for centuries, and you can only imagine something that takes 7 centuries to excavate. How much in one lifetime would a monk at that point in the time of Ashoka or shortly thereafter would have seen very little progress, maybe 3 or 4 inches of rock being carved out. But they did it. And I think that we ought to be patient with ourselves. We ought not to succumb to messianism. We ought not to applaud masterstrokes. We ought to do constitutionally the right things, the fair things, the ethical things, the moral things. And we will see in our time and in the time after us change of the sort that we want to see. And I think that ultimately is why I wrote that book. And I hope that is the message that the book carries to readers.
Let me be a little naughty, which I often am, and pick out one phrase from that answer. We ought not to succumb to messianism. That reflects the title of this book. There it is, After Messiah. And given what I said about the big man, it's pretty clear, without my having to say it, who the Messiah is and why the book is called After Messiah, because the big man dies in page 3 and everything that happens after that happens after him. Now, before I end, because I'm not going to carry on talking about the book, I'm now in danger of giving away things and spoiling it for the readership. I want instead to ask you 2 questions about yourself. What made you decide to write a work of fiction? It's so completely different to your searing critiques of the Modi government, which is what you're really best known for, or your pithy, perceptive columns.
I think there is an element of absurdity in our time, where, as I said, you have 2 nuclear armed states hostile to one another, where one of them lets loose by accident a missile that goes and land. This is very much yes, Prime Minister territory, that you've got a government where the quality of the people in charge, the lack of competence, very visibly shows. And I aimed to begin writing it in that fashion. Unfortunately, Yes Minister doesn't have character transition, just like all TV serials. In Friends, Joey remains Joey and Phoebe remains Phoebe from the first episode to the last. Here I wanted some change, and because I couldn't get that change from the leader, what I thought of was writing something that came after this leader went, which is pretty much how I wrote it. Writing fiction is difficult to me, much more difficult than writing non-fiction. An order of magnitude, I would say. It's very, very difficult. But I'm pleased that I wrote it because it taught me how it is that novels are written, and perhaps will lead me to reading novels better because I can appreciate what has gone in from the writer.
Now, right at the end, in the acknowledgement section, you say, and I'm quoting you, I echo the sentiment of Vince Gilligan, the creator of the American TV show Breaking Bad. Asked if he enjoyed writing, he responded, I enjoyed having written. Is that just relief that the book is finished, or are you also saying never again?
Not the latter, because I'm working on my next novel. But writing is difficult in a way that can be explained by going to the gym. It's not something that one looks forward to. It's not the idea that writers. There was this video yesterday of the Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh with a notebook in hand, sitting by the riverside, writing something. I don't know what it was that he was writing. That is not how writing works. Writing is faced with a wall. You've got your screen up or your notebook up. I write both longhand and on the computer. And finding it difficult to motivate yourself to do it. Most writers don't want to write. There are a few good days when the 1,500 words come out easily. But most of the time, I would say the majority of the time, it is hard going. And I thought that his words reflected what it was that I had felt during the writing of the novel. And I don't know why I'm putting myself through it once again, but I am.
But you're also reminding me of that old cliche. It's more perspiration than inspiration. But the funny thing is, the more you perspire, the more you actually want to do it.
That's true. I think that writing, it doesn't reward you in terms of money. Very few writers anywhere in the world, but particularly in South Asia, can make a living out of writing, because a bestseller is 5,000 copies. You could spend a year writing a book and make about 4 lakh rupees on that book. And that book would be a bestseller. So it's not that much money. But the reward comes out of the process, out of the satisfaction of doing it. And while it's hard, also, once again, going back to the theory of the gym, Once you come out of it, you feel a sense of relief, a sense of achievement, which very few things give you otherwise. I think writing is satisfying in a way that I would say no job can be, which is why many people who begin their careers as writers end their careers as one, even though they might not have made too much money.
Aakar Patel, let me end by congratulating you on your first book. It's a terrific read, and I truly recommend it to the audience as well. Thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.